Hello again. Now we're going to look at our framework and exports, or look at this from the point of view of an exporting country. So, before anything is changed, this is our market for that, whatever that is. And of course, at equilibrium, we have our consumer surplus, which again, this is like the cha-ching some consumers are getting to enjoy because the market price is actually lower than the price they're willing to pay. Granted, they would be buying fewer of the good, but they would be willing to pay. Some people would be willing to pay more for the good, and that is represented all along this portion of the demand curve above the equilibrium price. Down here, letter B, this area, this triangle corresponds to seller surplus. That's an abbreviated S for seller abbreviated with just the S. That's consumer abbreviated with just the C. So down here is the seller surplus represented by point B or area B. And this is like the cha-ching that sellers enjoy because some sellers would be willing to sell their good or service, whatever that is, for less than the market price. Granted, fewer units sold, but some would be sold, but they get to sell them not only for what they would sell them for, but at the market price, which is higher than what they would be requiring to get to sell their good or service, that. But now we're interested in exports. So what this means is this is a country that has comparative advantage in the production of that. They can produce that at a lower rate than other countries can, at a lower cost. They give up less to produce it. And so that means the world price that they face is higher than the market price. Now, in number 4 on the practice sheet, when we opened a country to trade, it hadn't been, and they were going to be an exporting country, what I said then was that's an increase in demand because it's more buyers. So if you're a country that sells this good and you get to now trade with some other country, you're thinking of that as a seller in that industry. You're like, cool, I can sell it to all those people now. So it's more buyers. So demand, it's like demand shifting up like this. And that's what we did when we were practicing with just supply and demand. That's not untrue. It's just that we don't draw it in these models in chapter 9 here with international trade because it ends up, I think the reason they don't draw it, and it's very typical the way it's set up here, is because it just creates so many more lines, it just kind of makes things confusing. So really, it's the same thing though. But what we draw then is just the price that would be achieved with this opening trade or with this greater demand. So that's like higher, just like it would be if we shifted demand to say here for PW, P sub W for price, for the world price. And at that world price, we have things happening along our market supply and market demand curve here. See, the sellers at a higher price are willing and able to sell more. So in fact, this becomes the quantity sold or supplied down here. But at higher prices, of course, you and I as consumers, we're willing and able to buy less. Law of demand and demand curve tell us that. So that's represented right there. That's at the higher price. This is the lesser amount that we're willing or able to buy at that higher price. So we have a gap between supply and demand. When we're looking at price floors, this was called excess supply or led to a surplus. But that's not what we're talking about. So far it just looks like that. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about this being the world price and the sellers being able to sell it at that world price now the trade is open. So they will, but consumers won't buy as much domestically. So the sellers are making it, but the consumers aren't buying it. So this gap down here, this becomes exports. It's the amount that the sellers will go ahead and produce. It won't be bought domestically, so it'll be sold abroad. That'll be exports, that space right down there. But in terms of our welfare analysis, this is what we're doing with these letters up here. We can see how it affects the market participants. So it used to be all of this upper triangle was A, consumer surplus, but now the price is higher. So you know that's not going to make consumers feel good. And another way that we can see that, other than just knowing the price is higher and just having a sense of it, is that the consumer surplus is now shifted. It's less. At this higher price, people who used to be willing and able to buy like this many here and even enjoy a surplus because it was even the price that they could buy it for at the market price was lower than they were willing to pay. Now they're priced out of the market. So they're not even going to buy it anymore. Not anywhere below here. So they're gone. So this, and I want to use the same letters. I already didn't. This isn't the, I have to change. I want. Well, there's no way to do it. This is now going to be B, to use the same letters that are in figure 2 of the textbook, so you have a reference to how they did that in the textbook. So this is now a piece of, B is now represents seller surplus. It's given to the sellers but taken from the consumers, because it was consumer surplus. Now sellers are enjoying that. So C is what the sellers always had, but now they have B and C. So afterwards, so far, B plus C, there's something missing, is seller surplus. A is still consumer surplus, but it's smaller. It used to be bigger, now it's smaller. But there's more. These are the pieces of surplus that we always had along here. But you notice, since this much is now going to be made, there's a new area relevant to our market here, and that's right here. So this is going to be D. And what's happening along D? Well, the sellers along the supply curve are now able to produce who weren't before, because the price is higher, so that will trigger them to produce. And some of them, maybe like right along here, would be willing and able to produce the good for only this price, like this height right here. But the world price is higher than that. So it's new cha-ching for the sellers all through this area of this triangle. So B plus C plus D becomes seller surplus. And that's why economists like this, is because, not because of the shift of B. The shift of B, economists are kind of neutral on that. That's a transfer. It went from the consumers to the sellers. So someone was made worse off, but somebody else was made better off by the same amount of B. That's okay. That's just a shift. What economists really like about this is D, because D is an area where someone is made better off without even making someone else worse off. So the net improvement by opening to trade is the area of this triangle, and it is 1/2 base times height. That's how you could calculate what that is if there were numbers on these things, if we wanted to do that. We don't need to do that, though. If you take it intermediate, that's when you start doing that kind of stuff. So that's a gain to society without any cost, just by opening up the trade. Which, if you think back to chapter 3, we showed the gains from trade, and this is really telling us the same thing using a different framework. And we even then used the production possibilities curve from chapter 2, and we saw how countries can consume beyond what they can produce with trade. And again, it's repeating the same kind of thing. We can get more when we specialize in trade. But keep in mind, there are winners and losers from these shifts. Even though this is a transfer and there's a net benefit, the consumers don't like it. They like it as workers. Same people, as we've said before, but in one capacity they don't like it, but in the other capacity they do. And so this leads us into the next piece that you'll see, which is things that get in the way with trade, looking at them. Things we talked about, many things we talked about before with chapter 3 as well, but now we're going to be looking at those things with our supply and demand framework.